Okay, so moving on here, you can see the study design dot point is a little bit longer. And I think while I'm on this idea of study design dot points, get into the habit of using the study design. Rely on study design. Memorize study design, not memorize it word for word, but know what dot points are covered on the study design. It helps you a lot in your short answer. It'll help you a lot next year in your 10 marker, or if your schools do 10 markers this year. And it can also guide your study really well. So I would recommend like using study design dot points, just like we're doing here. Like you can write them on top of your page and then write your notes from that, just so you know that you're on the right track. Because sometimes it's easy to kind of get off track with like lots of stuff in the textbook or in videos or in other resources you're using. So it's important to have the study design and be aware that you know that you're on track, you know that this is what's going to be covered in your tests, and you're not spending time learning stuff that's irrelevant. Okay, so looking at our study design dot point here, the usefulness and limitations of criteria to categorize behavior as typical or atypical. So it's this idea of, obviously everybody's different, very, 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 very different, which I'm sure you guys are aware of. And so you broadly can categorize behavior as typical or atypical. And so Vika, I want you to be aware of in what circumstances or in what ways is having criteria that almost like, again, puts people into boxes. Why is that helpful at certain points? But then also what are its limitations? So sometimes if we think of limitations, pretty obvious, as I mentioned, everybody is different. Everybody is shaped by their experiences. We've just talked about all these things that influence, psychological development. You got your emotional aspect, your cognitive aspect, your social aspect, your nature versus your nurture. Obviously, people are all going to be a little bit different. So when you categorize something as, typical or this is atypical behavior, and obviously if someone's demonstrating atypical behavior, it's something that you want to, figure out, why is their behavior atypical? Why is it different to what they usually do? And is this a sign of something going on, that might not be what you want it. Oh my gosh, I can't even speak. Might not be what you want to be happening. Or is it a sign of, neurological decline? Or is it just that, they've had a certain experience and they're acting a bit different? So that's why, it can be useful in sort of figuring out, does this individual need help? Has something gone on? Is there a reason why they're acting a bit different? But in terms of limitations, it can be, again, this idea of categorization, basically. It's almost like trying to, I don't know if you guys might be aware of like continuous and discrete data. So discrete data is like things that can be 1, 2, 3, or 4 almost. So it's like, children, how many children do you have? You've got one child, you've got 2 children, you've got 3 children. You can't have 1.5 children, 1.75, 1.8333 children. That's that idea of it being discrete. Whereas continuous, like height, it can be however many millimeters. So it's almost, to draw the analogy, it's almost like this idea of trying to force this continuous data to be discrete or to be categorical. So that's where those limitations can kind of come in. And obviously it's very tricky to describe something as normal, again, because of this idea that what's normal to some people may not be normal to others. So when we talk about being mentally healthy and having a mental disorder, we'll look at kind of the mental health continuum, and you look at that a lot next year as well. But again, it's this idea of what is this individual usually functioning like, and is it different, and how different is it? And then the big question, why is it different? So that's what you kind of think about there. Often with normality or, atypical and typical, it's less this idea of what do I think is normal? Is this person normal? But more so, what is this person usually like? Are they different from their usual self? Okay, so in terms of atypical behavior, again, very, very hard to describe it. So we do our best. You guys may be familiar with the DSM-5, very useful in psychology, kind of just describes mental disorders and things like that. So we'll have a look at the things that are listed kind of here. So violating social norms, this idea of, and again, this is not just your like not conforming to society. Obviously, that's very different. This idea of extreme kind of diversions or extreme, antisocial behavior. This idea of having atypical behaviors that actually are arising from a, condition, a diagnosable condition, personal distress. So this idea of how is it affecting their functioning, their daily life? Is it evident that this is causing this person distress and that they're struggling with it? Maladaptive behavior, again, sort of with this daily functioning. Is this behavior, just sort of different, or is it actually harmful? And then also cultural perspective. So as I've talked about, between individuals, it can be different as to what I perceive as normal may be different from what you perceive as normal, but then also cultural values. So, what one culture perceives as normal or not normal or atypical may be typical in a different culture or atypical. So it's very, very important to take all of these things into account. And that's why it can be very tricky to label behavior as atypical or typical. Okay, so then we look at normal variations of brain development within society, and we talk about this idea of neurodiversity. So again, we've talked about, psychological development, and specifically here we're looking at development of the brain and things, that might affect cognition in particular, and this idea of normal variations. So again, as I've discussed, it's this idea of everybody being different. There's no one way a brain is meant to develop. There's no one track or one timeline that a brain should develop in. And again, as I've said before, you think about genetics, you think about nurture, you think about your emotional, your social, etc., etc. All of these different things that influence the brain, your biopsychosocial model. There's so many things, so many different aspects that influences an individual's mental well-being, influences a person's psychological development, and even outside of that, physical development, things like that, and obviously how that interacts as well. So everybody kind of moves on a different timeline or on a different path in general. And that's what we see with these normal variations and this idea of neurodiversity. So as it suggests, this diversity, so this kind of difference. And again, if you think of like genetic diversity in a biological aspect, it's not this idea that it's, atypical or, the wrong kind of pattern of developing. It's just this idea that it's different. And again, it's just variations of development. So what we see here, different ways people experience and interact with their environment, and obviously this idea of learning, memory, cognition, all those sorts of things. And again, that everybody kind of behaves, learns, or thinks in different ways. You can imagine if everyone was to perform an action in the exact same way, if everybody was to learn in the exact same way, we'd all be robots, really. So some of the kind of neurodiverse conditions that you might talk about in class, obviously it depends. With Psych 1-2, there's a lot of leeway. Your schools can teach a lot of different things, but some of the typical ones you may see are ASD and ADHD. So with ASD, again, this idea of a spectrum, and we'll talk about, mental health being on a continuum as well. It's very similar, this idea of being on a spectrum. So it's even this diversity within the condition itself, about how some people may experience these variations, to differing extents. So we're seeing things like communication, behavior, learning, some of these variations that affect these sort of processes to do with brain development, psychological development. And again, because it's on a spectrum, this idea that, people with ASD won't be experiencing these variations similarly, to the same extent, in the same way. ADHD as well, we're thinking about this difficulty in completing tasks or performing tasks and routine. So that's, a behavior thing as well, where we, might think about others, doing more with cognition and things like that. ADHD we think of a lot with behavior and things like that as well. So again, there may be other conditions that you kind of look at in class, But yeah, there's a lot of examples when we discuss neurodiversity. Okay, so moving on now, again, a bit of a chunky study design dot point. So we're looking at the role of mental health workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, and organizations. So pretty multifaceted thing here in supporting psychological development and mental well-being, along with the diagnosis and management of atypical behavior, including what we're discussing here, culturally responsive practices. So in terms of the other aspects of the dot point, it's just this idea of, again, a multidisciplinary team. So you've got mental health workers, how they might differ from psychologists, how they might differ from psychiatrists, and actually organizations, so, support networks, that sort of thing, in terms of supporting this development and mental well-being. So when we're looking at culturally responsive practices, we have a few aspects of this here. So individual experiences, again, understanding, I feel like I'm harping on about the same thing here, but understanding that everybody's experienced different things in their lives and how this reflects in their development and in their behavior as well. Hiring diverse staff, so this idea of feeling kind of related to, seeing similar people, interacting in this idea of a comfortable environment is really important. Being involved in the community they work for as well. So, these psychologists, these psychiatrists, working in the, being involved and interacting in the community that they work for. Again, kind of links to that diverse staff aspect, just creates this familiar and comfortable environment. And I'm sure as you guys can imagine, if you're thinking of stuff to do with mental well-being, that's a really important aspect. And then lastly, listening carefully to patients' experiences. Again, almost tying in with the first dot point there, understanding, what patients have been through and this idea of past experiences and how that influences them as well.